On the morning of 28 November 1979, Air New Zealand Flight 901 left Auckland International Airport for an 11-hour return sightseeing flight to Antarctica. It was supposed to return to Auckland in the evening via Christchurch. At 12:49 p.m., the aircraft crashed into the lower slope of Mount Erebus on Ross Island, killing all 257 people on board. The accident is the deadliest accident in the history of Air New Zealand and one of New Zealand's deadliest peacetime disasters. This is the story of that fateful flight. Air New Zealand and Qantas began offering sightseeing flights to Antarctica in February 1977. The popularity of these flights and positive reports from passengers meant Air New Zealand needed to do little advertising to fill the seats on those it announced for November 1979. The airline offered an appealing package, meals and refreshments, a complimentary bar service, in-flight entertainment, and expert commentary. The flight was designed and marketed as a unique sightseeing experience, carrying an experienced Antarctic guide who pointed out scenic features and landmarks using the aircraft public address system, while passengers enjoyed a low-flying sweep up McMurdo Sound. The flights left and returned to New Zealand the same day. Flight 901 would leave Auckland International Airport at 8 a.m. for Antarctica and arrive back at Christchurch International Airport at 7 p.m. after flying 5,360 miles. The aircraft would make a 45-minute stop at Christchurch for refueling and crew change before flying the remaining 464 miles to Auckland, arriving at 9 p.m. Tickets for the November 1979 flight cost $359 New Zealand dollars per person, equivalent to around $3,000 in 2022. The flights usually operated at about 85% of capacity. The empty seats, usually the ones in the center row, allowed passengers to move more easily about the cabin to look out of the windows. The aircraft used on the Antarctic flights were Air New Zealand's 8 McDonnell Douglas DC-1030 trijets. The aircraft on 28 November was 182nd DC-10 to be built, and the 4th DC-10 to be introduced by Air New Zealand. It was handed over to the airline on 12 December 1974 at McDonnell Douglas Long Beach plant. It had logged more than 20,700 flight hours prior to the crash. By the time the Air New Zealand and Qantas terminated the flights, they had carried approximately 10,000 passengers to Antarctica. Many of the 237 passengers on board Air New Zealand Flight 901 were middle-aged or elderly. There were 22 Americans, 24 Japanese tourists, a handful of British, 2 Canadians, an Australian, and 1 each from Switzerland and France. The rest were New Zealanders, some such as 26-year-old Police Constable Trevor McLean of New Plymouth had won their seat. Others had been given tickets as a treat. Philippa Ward had been gifted one for her 21st birthday. Mark Gallagher had been given one by his grandparents, Elsie and Alfred Gallagher. All 3 were on board. Christchurch teacher Kristen Nicholson was heading south to Cape an intensive study course on the Antarctic. The head of the New Zealand Tourist Department, Michael Robert, was there, as was Lady Helen Robb, widow of the eminent heart surgeon Sir Douglas Robb. One couple had secured a ticket less than half an hour before takeoff. Wheelchair-bound Aucklander Walgreer Rollins had a last-minute change of heart, but the 76-year-old had been coaxed on board. Hostess Suzanne Mironovic, one of 15 cabin crew rostered for the flight, had overslept and might have missed it had she not received a phone call from Air New Zealand to rouse her. Another crew member, Steward Stephen Simmons felt unwell on waking but showed up regardless. So Edmund Hillary had acted as guide on previous flights. Hillary was scheduled to act as the guide for the fatal flight of 28 November 1979 but had to cancel owing to other commitments. His long-time friend and climbing companion, Peter Mulgrew, stood in as guide. And so it went. Men and women from diverse backgrounds, many with tender farewell kisses on their cheeks, and all about to share the adventure of a lifetime. 9 November 1979, Captain Jim Collins, 45, and co-pilot Greg Cassin, 37, flight crew on Air New Zealand's 28 November Antarctic flight, attended a briefing in which they were given a copy of the previous flight's flight plan. The plan gave coordinates for the trip to Antarctica and across McMurdo Sound. With these coordinates entered into the plane's computerized navigation system, it could fly automatically to its destination. Both Collins and Cassin had never been flown to Antarctica before, but they were experienced pilots and were considered qualified for the flight. They were advised of a VMC let-down procedure, which permitted them to descend to 6,000 feet over McMurdo if visibility was good. In the early hours of 28 November, a navigational coordinate in the flight plan presented at the briefing was changed. The airline's navigation section believed it was making a minor adjustment to the flight's long-standing destination point, but a typing error 14 months earlier meant it had actually shifted this point 27 nautical miles to the east. Instead of the route taking Flight 901 over sea ice, as Collins and Cassin had been briefed, it would take them directly over Mount Erebus, a 3,794-meter active volcano. The flight crew were not alerted to the change. On the morning of 28 November, they received the adjusted flight plan and programmed it into the navigation computer. A copy of the plan was radioed ahead to McMurdo Station, the American research base on Ross Island, whose air traffic controllers would be responsible for handling the plane while it was in Antarctic airspace. Once all 257 passengers and crew had boarded, the flight departed Auckland at 8:17 a.m. and climbed away into the summer sky. 4 hours after a smooth takeoff, the flight was 42 miles away from McMurdo Station. The radio communication center there allowed the flight to descend to 10,000 feet and to continue visually. Air safety regulation at the time did not allow flights to descend to lower than 6,000 feet, even in good weather, although Air New Zealand's own travel magazine showed photographs of previous flights clearly operating below 6,000 feet. Collins believed the plane was over open water. Collins told McMurdo Station that he would be dropping to 2,000 feet, at which point he switched control of the aircraft to the automated computer system. At around noon, Collins flew 2 large loops through the clouds to bring the plane down to about 2,000 feet and offer his passengers a better view. Assuming he was on the same flight path as previous flights and over the vast McMurdo Sound, he wouldn't have foreseen any problems. On board the DC-10, people were busy taking photographs and filming in the cabin and out of the windows. Outside, a layer of clouds blended with the white snow-covered volcano, forming a sector whiteout. No contrast between ground and sky was visible to the pilots. The effect deceived everyone on the flight deck, making them believe that the white mountainside was the Ross Ice Shelf, a huge expanse of floating ice derived from the great ice sheet of Antarctica, which was in fact now behind the mountain. As it was later understood, even by experienced polo pilots, Air New Zealand had provided no training for the flight crew and the sector whiteout phenomenon. As a result, the crew thought they were flying along McMurdo Sound when they were actually flying over Levis Bay in front of Mount Erebus. At 12:49 p.m., the plane's ground proximity warning system began sounding a series of full of alarms, warning that the plane was dangerously close to terrain. Pilots had begun a terrain escape maneuver by flying full power, but it was too late. 6 seconds later, the plane crashed into the side of Mount Erebus and exploded, instantly killing everyone on board. The accident occurred at 12:50 p.m. at an elevation of 1,467 feet above mean sea level. McMurdo Station attempted to contact the flight after the crash and informed Air New Zealand headquarters in Auckland that communication with the aircraft had been lost. United States search and rescue personnel were placed on standby. After hours of waiting and confusion, the assumption back in New Zealand was that the plane must have run out of fuel. Wherever it was no longer in the air. At 2 p.m., the United States Navy released a situation report stating, Air New Zealand Flight 901 has failed to acknowledge radio transmission. One LC-130 fixed-wing aircraft and two UH-1 rotary-wing aircraft are preparing to launch for search and rescue effort. Data gathered at 3:43 p.m. were added to the situation report, stating that the visibility was 40 miles. Also, 6 aircraft had been launched to find the flight. Flight 901 was due to arrive back at Christchurch at 6:05 p.m. for a stopover including refueling and a crew change before completing the remaining journey back to Auckland. Around 50 passengers were also supposed to disembark at Christchurch. Air Force staff initially told the waiting families that the flight being slightly late was not unusual, but as time went on, it became clear that something was wrong. At 9 p.m., about half an hour after the plane would have run out of fuel, Air New Zealand informed the press that it believed the aircraft to be lost. Rescue teams searched along the assumed flight path but found nothing. At 12:55 a.m., the crew of a United States Navy aircraft discovered unidentified debris along the side of Mount Erebus. No survivors could be seen. Around 9 a.m., 20 hours after the crash, helicopters with search parties managed to land on the side of the mountain. They confirmed that the wreckage was that of Flight 901 and that all 237 passengers and 20 crew members had been killed. The DC-10's altitude at the time of the collision was 1,465 feet. The wreckage made a 600-meter trail across the lower slopes of Mount Erebus. As the fuel tanks exploded, a fireball ripped through what was left of the fuselage. The force of the impact would have knocked the passengers out or killed them immediately. The task of recovering and identifying the bodies of the passengers and crew was made more difficult because of the numbers involved. Over 60 people worked on the accident site, most in body recovery. 213 victims were eventually identified. Bodies and fragments of the aircraft were flown back to Auckland for identification. The remains of 44 of the victims were not individually identified. A funeral was held for them on 22 February 1980. Early in the investigation into the causes of the disaster, it became clear that there was no mechanical reason for the crash. The information on the flight recorder tapes showed there had been no emergency in the cockpit of the aircraft. Attention was then focused on the possibility of pilot error. Two main reasons have been determined as the cause of the crash. The pilots had been briefed with a flight path which was different from the one put into the plane's computer. The crew thought their route was the same as previous flights, going over ice and water in the McMurdo Sound, when in fact the path was going over Ross Island and Mount Erebus. The second cause was a weather phenomenon known as sector whiteout, and that's what's likely to have sealed the plane's fate. The whiteout means the light between the white snow or ice underneath and the clouds overhead created an illusion of clear visibility. The pilot trusted the automatic flight path, assuming the white he was seeing through the cockpit window was simply the ice and snow on the water below, not the face of a mountain. It's assumed that had it not been white out, Collins would have been dropped down the plane despite a different flight path. A report by the Chief Inspector of Aircraft Accidents, Ron Chippendale, came out in May 1980. It stated that the decision of the captain in dropping to a height below the approved level and continuing at that height when the crew was not sure of the plane's position had been the main cause of the accident. Putting the blame on the pilot proved controversial. The government announced a one-man Royal Commission of Inquiry, New Zealand's highest level of public inquest. The results couldn't have been more different. This time, the blame landed squarely on Air New Zealand. Yes, the plane had been well below the safe altitude, but the inquiry found that the Antarctic flights had routinely flown at such extremely low levels to provide a better view for its paying customers. Even a promotional brochure for the scenic route had boasted of the scenery using photographs clearly taken from way below the safe altitude. Mann found that Captain Collins had been authorized by McMurdo Station to descend to 450 meters and could not be said to have been guilty of unauthorized low flying. The Royal Commission did not only find that the airline was to blame due to the mistakes in the flight path, but it also alleged that Air New Zealand had essentially tried to cover up its own responsibility, a conspiracy to blame the pilots, leaving Air New Zealand morally in the clear, and also in terms of compensation payouts to the victims' relatives. Famously, the head of the inquiry, Judge Peter Mahon, described the airline's defense as an orchestrated litany of lies, a phrase which would stick in the national consciousness. Air New Zealand and the Civil Aviation Division were ordered to pay the costs of the inquiry, and the airline had to pay an extra fee of $150,000. The chief executive of Air New Zealand resigned a week after the report was released to the public. Debate on where the blame for the crash should be placed continued. The changed flight path was in line with Mount Erebus but would have been safe if there had been no drop in height below the recommended level. The airline took the case to an appeals court and won, with Mr. Mann's allegation they intentionally had obscured the crash causes overturned. Again, the Erebus tragedy was in limbo, and the blame game grotesquely overshadowed the relatives' grief. A wooden cross was erected above Scarbase to commemorate the disaster. It was replaced in 1996 with an aluminium cross after the original one was eroded by ice and snow. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and comment, and if you want to see more videos, please consider subscribing to the channel.